here we are, right? Section 2, so we've finished section 1. We are going to continue, hopefully staying afloat in the deeper end of the pool, so to speak, right? So we are segueing into metaphysics. We've already been kind of doggy paddling in the deeper end. At the end of the epistemology, right, we started to get into some of the implications of metaphysics. We already started to talk about Berkeley's idealism, so we've already been kind of wrestling with some of this metaphysics stuff already. We've gotten a taste for just how difficult it can be. So I would kind of preface our transition into this second section by saying it can be arguably some of the most difficult material, right? And you probably sense that. So it is in the deeper end of the philosophical pool. Now, having said that, maybe this helps kind of accept the difficulty. I do think the issues in the metaphysical waters, so to speak, are some of the more interesting ones, right? So like, what do we make of our thoughts, right? Is that indicative of some kind of unique, immaterial, non-physical type of existence? Right? That's a fascinating question that philosophers and average everyday people have been wrestling with for a long time. Are we free? Truly free? A lot of us think that we're free, but are we? Or are we just a product of all these antecedent factors? Right? De Halbach, our representative of determinism, as we'll see later in the second section, is going to say we're no different than a ball being thrown in the air. We're just complicated balls, right? We all recognize that the ball isn't free as it glides through the air, right? It has that initial velocity, which is determining its trajectory. Then it's got other forces working on, like gravity, wind resistance. All these forces are affecting it in a certain sort of way, right? That's determining what happens for it. Well, he says, we're no different. We're kind of different in that we're much more complicated, right? But really what's going on with us is, in some sense, no different, right? The reason why we don't as readily appreciate that we are just as determined as the ball is because we have billions of forces working on us versus the ball only has like 2 or 3 or 4, right? We forget about our childhood experience watching certain media. We forget about our best friend and how our interactions with that best friend may have influenced a lot of what we did as a kid, and then later, our behavior later. We forget about our experience in Philosophy 100 and how life-changing that was, 20 years later. And we lose sight in terms of how those things are still affecting, right, us, right, that affect the consequences of these things, right? It might dissipate slightly, but these things are still exerting an influence and effect on us in our trajectory throughout life. And de Halbach's just saying, right, basically, that is like the same thing as the ball, right? It's just, it's muddied by the fact that there's so many other forces at play. And if it weren't for the fact that there are these countless forces like influencing us, we would more readily observe that we are in fact determined, just like the ball. So I kind of foreshadowed way more than I intended there, right? But we'll be getting into that whole fascinating discussion about free will. Right? Are we just complicated balls, or is there something unique, and different about us, right? Are we in fact free, right, from the material laws that dictate all the movement of the ball, right? So difficult waters, but I think rewarding and interesting nonetheless. So we're gonna take the same approach as we do whenever we are coming to a new land in the realm of philosophy. We're gonna start very broadly in this intro lecture, right? We're gonna get an introduction to what metaphysics is, very broadly speaking. We're gonna allude to some of the kind of key facets of metaphysics, and then also shine a light on what we're gonna specifically focus on ourselves. Okay, so one of the things we'll see very early on is that metaphysics is a very broad umbrella sort of heading within philosophy that usually covers a lot of territory. So in other words, a lot of things are subsumed under metaphysics. Okay, and we are going to, for better or worse, right, given practical considerations and time and so on, we're going to really focus our attention on these 2 central issues in metaphysics. So we'll explain that, talk about that. We're going to get into, this issue in particular, philosophy of mind, and like what it is, what that whole debate's about, right? And we'll see what's kind of a central feature to that. We'll talk about the major positions that are available with respect to this issue, okay? And one of the things we'll talk about is that there's this broader question, right? How many types of existence and what's real, okay? And then you can apply that sort of broad question to specifically the notion of the mind, right? And what we mean by thoughts, emotions, etc. Okay, and we'll talk about, broadly speaking, what types of existence are there through the lens of that specific discussion of the philosophy of mind. So I just want to mention that, right? But so the whole point is like the materialists with respect to the philosophy of mind. So if they're construing mind and thoughts and emotions as just being material, physical processes, they're going to be likely a materialist in a broader sense as well, with respect to existence in general, right? All that exists is material, whether it's just what we mean by a mind or things in general, right? They're going to say everything is material, okay? And I'm just suggesting at this point, right, that our discussion, right, while we're applying it specifically to the philosophy of mind, right, we are in some sense touching upon the question in general, right? What types of existence are there, right? Is it everything material? Is there a unique type of existence beyond the physical material world, call it spiritual or mental, right? Or not, right? Or is everything, maybe as Berkeley suggests, for all we know, it's all mental, all ideas? How do we know, right, what's implied in this notion that there's an external material world? What's implied is that remove us in our perceptions, something would continue to exist independent of us, independent of our perceptions. But like Berkeley says, what is that? What's our justification for that? We've never had a perception of any reality that didn't require our perception, or of a reality that existed beyond our perception. So what are we basing that in? Right? It's not rationally justified, he said. So, right, that's going to be, again, the camp that says there's only one type of existence, and it's all mental or ideas. Right? We have no basis upon which to suggest there's anything external outside of our minds. Okay, so we'll see that in general there's two monistic views. In other words, there's one type of existence or reality, single, mono. And then there's the dualists, right, who's suggesting there's two types of existence, okay? So we're going to wrestle with the question of what types of existence are there in general, right? We'll be kind of alluding to that, but we're going to home in on and specifically sort of discuss that question or more general issue through the lens of this more specific debate about the philosophy of mind, okay? So hopefully some of that is clear. And then we're going to get into kind of a related issue, right? So if we have minds, and if something about this notion of mind that is signaling or suggesting that there's something immaterial about us, well, how do other animals fit into this? Do they also have minds? They seem to exhibit the same sorts of things, well, at least we'll get into this, right? They seem to exhibit some of the same sorts of things that we associate with having a mind. So do they also have a mind? And if so, then do they have like a soul? Because a lot of times minds are associated with souls, right? So are they, if that's the case, do they also have minds and souls? And if that's the case, are we really no different than other animals then? Is there not a significant difference? A lot of times we tend to think of ourselves as being unique from other animals, from other sentient creatures. There's something special about us. But is that really the case? Especially if these other animals are construed as having minds and spirits or souls as well. Right, so and I think, again, that's another really fascinating angle. It's something I've thought a lot about. Is like, how are we, if at all, different or significantly different from other animals? So we'll get into that kind of that aspect as well. So a lot on our plate, so to speak, for this introduction to metaphysics. But again, it's pretty general stuff. So foreshadowing then the next 4 lectures, we are going to spend quite a bit of time, right? We'll get a taste and an introduction to the general positions here in this lecture. And then the plan moving forward, right, we're going to spend quite a bit of time on this philosophy of mind. We're going to get 4 lectures on it. We're going to start with dualism, and we'll get like a pro-dualism, and we'll revisit Descartes for that. And then we're going to get kind of some criticism of dualism by way of Gilbert Ryle. And we'll talk about materialism. Paul Churchland's going to give us a kind of explication of the varieties of materialism and in some sense a general defense of materialism. And then we'll talk about Nagel and his famous sort of criticism of materialism and how it doesn't seem to actually fully capture what we mean. He's going to say, Nagel, what we fully mean by consciousness and the subjective nature of it. Okay, so again, foreshadowing what's coming next. In this intro lecture, we're going to just briefly introduce those positions, and then we'll get a much more detailed look at them moving forward. But let's back up before we get into those, right? And let's start very broadly this very notion of metaphysics. Okay, we've been teasing this for a long time actually in this course, going back to lecture 1. You guys remember we went through the history of philosophy, but then we also covered the primary or traditional branches of philosophy, and one of those 4, right? Epistemology, ethics and logic, and then metaphysics, right? So it is one of the 4 primary branches of philosophy, and we, again, have been alluding to it and talking about some of the implications of epistemology on metaphysics for quite some time now. So you should probably have a fairly decent grasp of what it is in general at this point, right? It's anything, any sort of element or question or issue regarding what exists or what's real. Think like the Matrix, or like, you know, possibility that we're dreaming, like Descartes and our discussions of that already kind of got into some metaphysical stuff, right? How can we really be sure what's really happening or what even is really happening, right? And our, you know, part of that is then like, what truly exists? How many distinct types of existence are there, right? This is all getting them into metaphysics. So any question or issue related to existence or reality in general is obviously going to be metaphysics. And then a point I'm going to make is that we also have a lot of things subsumed under metaphysics, right? A lot of things fall under the heading of metaphysics. We're going to specifically focus on these. I would say these are 2 of the maybe primary or central issues, the main issues, a couple of them at least, within metaphysics, philosophy, mind, and free will. But there are other sort of really interesting issues that fall under the heading of metaphysics as well. Oftentimes philosophy of religion. Okay, we're actually going to talk about that, but later in the course, right? That's oftentimes associated with metaphysics as well. Questions about meaning, okay, that sort of thing will oftentimes be construed as metaphysics. And so I just want to mention a lot, right, falls under the heading of metaphysics within philosophy. And that's why, in some sense, we're spending an entire section 2 on metaphysics, okay, and specifically highlighting these key issues in metaphysics. But wanted to acknowledge there are issues beyond the specific ones we're going to address, right? Metaphysics is arguably the widest reaching sort of the 4 branches, right? There's a lot that falls under that traditional notion of metaphysics. This buzzword ontology, I do want to draw your attention to that real quick. So that is a word you will encounter frequently in these kinds of discussions and in the associated scholarship. We're not going to worry about like teasing out some difference between ontology and metaphysics. If we were taking an upper level grad course or something like that, you know, philosophers will sort of work out a nuanced difference between ontology and metaphysics. But for our purposes, right, whenever you encounter ontology, it more or less just means what we mean by metaphysics, okay? What exists, what's real. It's ontology is a question about being, what actually exists. Okay. Now the term itself, metaphysics, is actually credited to Aristotle. So Greek dude, we've mentioned Aristotle a host of times now up to this point in the course. So Aristotle's the one that's credited with first coining the term metaphysics. Okay. And it can be a bit of a misnomer, at least nowadays, because nowadays it has a much wider connotation than when he first introduced it. So that's the point here. It literally means etymologically, right? The term literally translates after or beyond physics. So it's referencing like non-physical beings. So Aristotle literally wrote a book called Physics, and he literally wrote a book called Metaphysics, or at least there are books by Aristotle now, whether these were his students putting together lecture notes or what exactly comprises these. There are works by Aristotle or supposedly by Aristotle. One is called Physics, one's called Metaphysics, right? So he has a book called Metaphysics. And for him, right, when he's discussing this, it means literally, right, his discussion of things beyond physics, beyond the material world, okay? And my point here is, nowadays that has a much wider connotation. So when he was using the term, right, when he was discussing metaphysics, he was exclusively discussing, right, aspects beyond the material world. Whereas nowadays, people are said to be doing metaphysics, anybody who's interested in a question what exists or what's real, including those who are going to suggest all that exists is the material natural world, they're going to be said to still nonetheless be doing metaphysics, okay? Even though they're rejecting the idea that there's anything after or beyond physics, right? The materialist is implicitly rejecting that very notion. And so the point here is we still call the materialist a metaphysician, right? We still say the materialist is doing metaphysics, even though their actual position rejects the idea that there's anything after or beyond the physical natural world. Does that make sense what that point is? Okay. So yeah, so it has a wider reaching connotation or meaning nowadays than it did when Aristotle first was using and employing the term. Okay? So again, metaphysics just signals any interest or discussion of what exists and what's real. So I mentioned, right, we're going to kind of approach metaphysics from two different angles, and especially here early on through the lens of discussions regarding the philosophy of mind. Right? So philosophy of mind is a specific sort of aspect of metaphysics then that deals with this perceived mind-body distinction and the so-called mind-body problem. Working out, in other words, it's in some sense, it's like working out what we mean by this. What exactly do we mean when we reference the mind? How should we explain what we mean by the mind? Is it signaling or referencing something that is purely physical, as the materialist is going to suggest, or what we associate with the mind, is that indicative of something immaterial, truly unique, and not something that can be captured in material physical terms like this stuff seems to be able to. Right? We're able to, right, completely describe most of these objects in completely physical terms, whereas the dualist is going to say that's not the case when it comes to what we mean by the mind. Things like thoughts, emotions, feelings. Right? The dualist is going to insist we can't capture those kinds of experiences in physical terms. Okay? They can't be reduced to just physical stuff. It is truly indicative of a unique type of existence that's not physical, that's not public. Right? There seems to be something about what we associate with the mind, the dualist is going to insist, right, that is different from like this computer or this desk. Right? These things are public. Everyone in here can experience them in a way that you guys, thankfully, can't experience my thoughts. Because otherwise, if you guys did have access to them, maybe none of you would still be sitting in here because you'd be so scared, right? No, don't. Well, and this is true in fairness for all you guys, too. It's probably good that we're not privy to all your thoughts, right? Who knows what the heck's going on in your minds, right? And that's the whole point, though, in part of the dualist. Doesn't it seem like there is something different about that? At the very least, it doesn't seem as public and accessible. It only seems, as we'll see here in a quote here, only seems to be directly observable or experienced by the individual, him or herself, versus this seems to be something we can all directly experience or observe. Okay, so, but anyway, kind of foreshadowing some positions on this. The whole discussion and debate is what we mean by the philosophy of mind. How should we interpret what we tend to mean by the mind? Okay? And this whole notion that there is a distinction, this mind-body distinction, well, actually, the materialists and the idealists, they're going to deny the viability of the distinction in the first place. Right? The materialist is going to be like, what do you mean by mind? There is no distinction between the mind and the body. The mind just is a part of the body. There's nothing above and beyond what we mean by the brain. Right? There's just neurons firing in certain ways in certain parts of the brain, either functioning properly or not. Right? There's nothing beyond that. Okay? So what do you mean by mind? And conversely, the idealist, someone like Berkeley, is going to say, what do you mean by body? Right? What do you mean by something that continues to exist even when you're not perceiving it? Like, what are you talking about? You've never had any indication that something continues to exist beyond your perception. You've always been viewing all of reality through your perception, right? So whether we're talking about the idealist or the materialist, these monistic views are going to kind of reject the idea that there is even a distinction in the first place. Does that make sense? Okay, so really the only camp or position that's going to lend credence to this is the dualist. Okay? But in general, right, the whole debate and issue is, what do we make of this so-called mind? Okay, and what do we associate with mind? Again, like thoughts, feelings, emotions, things we can imagine. Someone was bringing that up in the 930 class. I can imagine a unicorn. Okay, that seems to be indicative of something like non-material going on, right? I can't see a unicorn out there, right? It doesn't seem to be something like that's really physical in any sense, and yet I have an experience of imagining a unicorn, right? So they wanted to suggest, doesn't that seem to imply something non-physical or non-material about our experience? Okay, so anyway, what do we make of these kinds of things? Now, what has been the primary reason or motivation for philosophers historically thinking that there was something beyond the material physical world. And not just philosophers. I say philosophers, I think here. Do I also mention, but this isn't, okay, my whole point here is, this isn't just true of the philosophers. Presumably, most of you in here as well think there's something going on that's not just material. At least if you're like the first two sections, who were predominantly dualist. In fact, the 930 class, there was only one non-dualist in the entire class. Okay, so it's not just philosophers who seem inclined to think there's something going on in reality that's not just physical. It seems like most of us, most average everyday people, right? So this is me acknowledging that, right? What is it? What do most people point to as being indicative? What phenomenon? I'm opening this up, so what do you guys think? What is it? What do we point to usually as being indicative of something non-material going on? Well, actually, so one of the themes we're going to mention, and welcome to philosophy, is like none of these camps or positions are like problem-free, right? So, hey, welcome to philosophy. Again, maybe our best tactic is going to be to like kind of lean towards whatever position seems least problematic. So, right, we're going to go through like, I mean, we're going to address idealism and kind of set it to the side because it's by far the least popular, and so we just have to, I tend to cater towards what you'll encounter the most, right? Because I have to like set things aside. We just don't have enough time. So we'll really focus on these two, and I'm going to mention, right, that they have significant problems, both of them, right? So the materialists, we've already kind of alluded to what their main difficulty is, right? The fact that there seems to be this so-called mind that so many of us appeal to, right? There seems to be some sort of subjective aspect of our experience, right? Call it, you know, the phenomena of the mind or whatever, thoughts, emotions, feelings, right? That doesn't seem to be something that is perfectly parallel or on par with physical stuff, okay? And so the dualist is going to insist the materialist really doesn't adequately capture that or handle that, right? So that's the big problem for them. But as we're going to see, the dualists themselves then have a major hurdle. If you're going to insist that there really are these two types of distinct existence or substance, how do we make sense of them nevertheless interacting and affecting one another? That's the notorious difficulty for the dualist then, right? How does my thought of wanting to raise my right hand actually bring about an effect in the physical world if that thought is truly not physical? Where's the point of connection? How do they influence and affect one another? That's going to be a major problem for the dualist. Okay, so again, kind of to your point, you know, if there was like a problem-free, obvious position, then we wouldn't be having this debate and discussing this, right? We would all just be whatever that obvious position was, right? So, yeah, unfortunately, welcome to philosophy. It's probably going to be a matter of which of these seems the least problematic. Whoops, pretend you didn't see that. Close your eyes. No, I went the wrong way. All right, what is it that so many of us allude to? Consciousness, right? Which is kind of what we mean by the mind, right? We're signaling our subjective conscious experience, right? Consciousness seems to be the phenomenon, conscious experience seems to be the phenomenon that both philosophers and average everyday folks point to as being the reason, right? Or signaling why so many of us think there is something that exists beyond the material physical world of these objects. Yeah. But I feel like I've encountered students who said that's true of them. And it's almost like I can't even relate to you. Like the buzzword is consciousness, okay? And what do we associate with that? Usually like thinking, feelings, emotions. I mentioned imagination, imagining things in your conscious experience. Internal dialogue. Yeah, that whole conversation that you have in your head. Like nobody else is getting that. Like I can't see it. I can't hear it. Yeah, trust me. I'm really good at singing in here. You can't hear it. But believe me, have faith, right? So consciousness, right? That seems to be the thing we point to, and that's the general kind of the word for like, you know, all those things therein. So like thoughts, emotions, feelings, etc. Because if you remove that, that's sort of conscious experience that we have, and presumably other animals as well. We'll get into that. But if you remove that sense of consciousness, though, it seems like then everything would just be physical that's left over, right? I mean, everything else about reality, at least as we're perceiving it, does seem to be kind of physical, right? And so, again, it would behoove us to point out the dualist is not rejecting there isn't physical stuff, right? They're just insisting there's something more, okay? But remove that consciousness, and it does seem like everything that remains seems to be physical, right? So that consciousness, there's something about that is the impetus then for us, or many of us and many philosophers, presuming there's something going on besides just physical or material phenomena. So the notion, rather, of consciousness is cited in most answers to this question because, again, without it, it seems like everything really is just physical or material. So from the textbook, 314, as opposed to the physical world, quote, consciousness is not solid or material. It's not something you can point to. Okay? It's not extended in three-dimensional space, does not occupy space at all. Is directly observable only by the person who owns it. That's kind of what I was mentioning earlier. Thankfully, and that's the reason why you guys are all still in your seats, right, and haven't dropped the class, okay? Cannot be measured and seems incapable of causing things to happen in accordance with invariant laws of mechanics. It's not subjected in some sense to the same, doesn't seem to be subjected to the same natural physical laws of material stuff, right? It seems to, in some sense to lie outside that. Okay. Now, of course, the materialist is just going to reject that. But so I'm drawing, when I say Arjo here, so that's Dennis Arjo is an instructor over at Johnson County Community College, and some of the instructors over there put together the book they work with when they're teaching Introduction to Philosophy. So when I was teaching over there, I was using that text. I like the way they kind of describe the issue and the perspective of the dualist here. Okay, so as they say, quote, our capacity for thought, our extraordinary use of language, our ability to engage in elaborate flights of imagination and invention, the richness of our emotional lives, our seemingly endless technological progress, and even the very fact of the mysterious flame of consciousness itself, all have been occasions for claims of human uniqueness, and for the idea that there is more to us than our strictly physical nature. Now, whether the human uniqueness comes in or not, right, we're going to sort of wrestle with that later. Maybe it's the case that we aren't the only ones with consciousness, and maybe that's consciousness really does signal an immaterial type of existence, and it might be the case that it's not unique to us, but there's still something immaterial going on, right? So whether or not that conscious experience is unique to us and whether or not it's indicative of some sort of immaterial existence, right? Those are, I would say, two separate issues, okay? And we'll get into each of them. But yeah, the consciousness, right? Whether that truly, and what we mean by consciousness, whether that truly signals a distinct type of existence, right? A spiritual, mental, non-material, or immaterial existence or not, that is the issue, okay? So yeah, that's the issue, right? So the philosophy of mind is chiefly concerned with teasing out what exactly is indicated by this notion of consciousness. And we're gonna have different perspectives on that. Okay. Speaking of which, I introduced them in this intro lecture, materialism, then dualism, then idealism, but actually moving forward in subsequent lectures, we'll start with dualism and then move into materialism for what it's worth. But materialists, right, their general position, and I mentioned earlier, right, usually if someone's a materialist when it comes to the philosophy of mind, they're going to be a materialist broadly speaking, right? So with respect to existence in general, they're just going to say all that exists is material, including what we supposedly mean by consciousness. Okay? So just making that point. We're going to view and discuss this kind of more broad metaphysical debate, what types of existence are there, exclusively through the lens of this discussion of the mind and consciousness. Okay? But just FYI, again, if someone's a dualist when it comes to this, they're a dualist in more generally speaking as well. Okay, so usually the materialist is going to say either, well, most materialists are going to say we're making way too much out of this notion of consciousness. Okay, either, in Churchland, when we get to Churchland's explication of materialism, he's going to get into the different varieties. So he's going to suggest there's reductive materialism and eliminative materialism. Okay, so either the materialist, one way or another, is going to say we're making too much of consciousness. Either what we mean by thoughts, emotions, feelings can be reduced, in other words, can be talked about and explained in purely physical terms, or it ought to be eliminated altogether. Okay, one way or another, in either of those versions, right, we're better off kind of stopping or no longer using, right, the typical terms we have been using, right, mental stuff, consciousness, thoughts and emotions, instead using purely physiological terms, right? So both varieties of materialism are going to suggest that eventually, you know, we will develop, as our sciences mature and get better, we'll develop sophisticated physiological terms and ways of explaining things that we aren't yet privy to or don't yet have access to, that'll make things much easier and better. So for example, instead of coming in and being like, oh, I'm so angry today, we'll come in and be like, oh, neuron 748A389er isn't firing properly this morning. Right? We'll come in and say something like that. Okay? And as odd as that sounds, the idea is actually we'll be able to more precisely communicate, right, our experiences, because we'll have a more precise sort of verbiage and terms to use, right? And again, that's born out of purely physical and material phenomena, okay? So again, regardless of the version of materialism, the idea is going to be the notions of consciousness, thoughts, emotions, feelings, okay? That's really misleading, okay? And we're better off, again, either reducing those kinds of terms to just physical terms or getting rid of them altogether. And in either case, just using physical terms to describe our experience. Okay. So materialism or physicalism, by the way, physicalism is synonymous with materialism. They both mean the same view. All that exists is material or physical stuff. Okay. So thoughts, emotions, feelings, those sorts of things, those are all reducible or can be reduced. What we mean by that stuff is really just, you know, reflective of the brain, and in some sense more generally the body working in certain ways, right? Neurons firing or not firing, right? Regions of the brain lighting up or not lighting up, etc. So when we experience sadness, what we mean by that is really just neuron X432 working or in a certain way, right? So that's what the materialist is going to suggest. We tend to think of it as being lofty and indicative of something special about us, but really it's not. It's just another physiological process happening, okay, which we experience as something we call sadness or anger. Quote, the theory that the mind or soul is physical or can be reduced to the physical is called materialism or physicalism. So that's from 314 of our text. So again, the idea on the part of most of the materialists, especially the eliminative materialists who say we should just get rid of these altogether because they are so radically misleading. Right? The idea is we will eventually, and we should eventually adopt a purely physical manner of speaking about these kinds of things. Okay? And we'll see over time, if things go well, say the materialists, we'll see less and less talk in terms of these terms and more in terms of brain functions and regions of the brain and neurons and all that sort of stuff. Okay. So we should try to distance ourselves from, again, this manner of speaking, because it gets us to erroneously believe that we're somehow special and that there is this sort of unique type of existence that's not physical, when in reality there's not. Okay, so the materialists suggest then, as the Arjo text points out, that, quote, we are, when all is said and done, purely physical beings living in a thoroughly natural world. Now, just like we talked about, especially at length towards the end of lecture 8 in the epistemology section, how epistemology is going to have lots of implications on metaphysics. And we saw that play out with Berkeley's idealism born out of Locke's theory of perception and epistemology. Well, so too, right, one's metaphysical view is going to have implications on epistemology and what we can be said to know, right? Insofar as the materialist is suggesting all that exists is the natural, material, empirical world, by implication, they're going to suggest then that the empirical sciences that examine the natural world can deliver all possible knowledge, right? Insofar as we can know something, the sciences can tell us what it is, right? Because all that exists is natural, and the sciences study that. Okay? So there is no possible knowledge lying beyond the empirical realm, right? So in some sense, the empirical sciences deliver all possible knowledge, or can deliver all possible knowledge to us. So there is that kind of epistemological implication, right, of the materialist view. Actually, there's a lot of implications of not just the materialist view, but whatever view you take in this debate, will have implications then on a lot of other aspects of philosophy. And I think this is a point really emphasizing because it's maybe not as readily obvious to us, right? So if we take a materialist position with respect to this sort of thing, right, what the mind ultimately is, we don't necessarily think about the repercussions of that and how that might be inconsistent with some of the other things we think we believe in. For example, free will. For example, believing in heaven and hell. For example, believing in such a thing as morality. It might not be obvious right away, but there are a lot of things that follow downstream is the way I put it, right? That follow downstream from taking a particular metaphysical position. So think about it, right? If you're going to say everything that exists is material, right? What kind of implications does that have on free will then? De Holbach, I think I mentioned this, right? He's going to say exactly. So if you have a thoroughgoing appreciation for science, okay, then you will appreciate that everything that exists is material and physical, and in some sense you can't help but be a determinist then, because everything that exists is empirical and natural, and everything that's empirical and natural is subjected to these natural laws, the physical laws that govern everything in nature, including our own behavior. So if you really are a thoroughgoing scientist and appreciate this, and hence are a materialist and think everything truly is natural, and if everything in nature is governed by these mechanical, physical laws, that would include our own behavior then, right? Because you're saying we're entirely material. So where is the room for free will there? Which implies, right, an ability to act outside of these mechanistic laws of nature. Where is that wiggle room, right? If we truly are just physical beings, entirely natural, material, physical beings, then where do we locate that freedom? De Holbach picks up on that and says, there is nowhere to locate it. It doesn't exist, right? So it seems to be, materialism is usually thought to be inconsistent then with free will. Okay, so that is something that follows downstream. Well, what happens if you reject free will? There goes, seemingly, the rejection of free will is usually thought to be at odds with heaven and hell. I mean, how do we make sense of a God punishing or rewarding someone who couldn't have behaved any differently? Which is what it means to not have free will. You couldn't have done any differently than whatever it is you did throughout your whole life. So on what basis is God punishing or rewarding you when you were just an automaton and couldn't have done any differently? It'd be like, again, rewarding or punishing a machine. Because that's basically someone who, in some sense, someone who treats us as if we have no free will, in some sense is saying we're like a machine. Granted, we're complicated, right? But how do we hold a machine accountable? Like, why would it make sense to punish a machine or reward a machine? Not really. And so too, if you're rejecting free will, how can you make sense, parallel point, how do you make sense of morality? How can you hold someone accountable for what they did from a moral perspective if they had no choice and couldn't have behaved any differently? Right? Do you guys see the point here? So it's interesting, right? You don't necessarily immediately associate assuming everything is material, that exists as material, with all these implications on other issues, but they do follow, right? How do you, if you're going to insist everything is material, where do you make room for free will? How do you accommodate the notion of moral responsibility or eternal reward and punishment? So a lot of other stuff seems to be all of a sudden inconsistent as well. Right? So it's kind of interesting to note that. I already made this point. One of the upshots of the materialist position is that the empirical sciences can give us all possible knowledge. Okay? There's nothing to know beyond the natural world. So the empirical sciences, which study that natural world, give us, could possibly give us a complete knowledge, right? There's nothing beyond what they can give us in terms of knowledge. So for the materialist, quote, and we're not going to get into, by the way, this is spelling out some of the other implications, okay? So there's a lot of famous concepts and big ideas in the history of philosophy that materialism, if you really think through it, seems inconsistent with. So again, we're not going to get into the weeds of some of this stuff like Kantian noumena or Platonic forms for that matter. This idea of Platonic forms, real quick, it's this idea that Plato suggests, right? This ephemeral transitory world of sense perception is actually, in some sense, not the truest sense of reality. There's actually an ultimate other realm of reality, the realm of the forms and ideas that in some sense are, it's weird, but more real, right, than this ever-changing, transitory realm of sense perception, right? So he's one who posits what we're experiencing, right? There's something beyond it. Well, there goes that, right? So again, we're not going to get into the weeds of that other than to just say, right, there's an example of a big philosophical idea that doesn't seem consistent or congruent with materialism. So that's why this is the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy in their article on naturalism. That's why in that article, right, it suggests the materialists, for the materialists, quote, there are no Platonic forms, Cartesian mental substances or minds, Kantian noumena or any other agents, powers, or entities that do not, in some broad sense, belong to nature or the physical world, material world. As a very loose characterization, it may suffice to say that nature is the order of things accessible to us through observation and the methods of the empirical sciences. Okay, we've been picking up on this already. Lots of things follow downstream from adopting a materialist position. And conversely, say the same thing but kind of the opposite way, right? If you accept dualism, right, downstream, well then you're going to be able to better accommodate, it seems like, the notion of free will. You're going to be able to better accommodate, it seems like anyway, the notion of supernatural religions with heavens and hells and afterlives, right? You're going to be able to better accommodate the notion of morality and moral responsibility and culpability. Okay, so we've already been picking up on that, right? So just to, again, capture again some of the implications from the materialist position. There go Platonic forms, no Kantian noumena, the existence of an afterlife, in other words, what's implied, some sort of existence after this one, beyond this natural, earthly existence. Well, that's what the materialist is denying. There is nothing beyond this earthly, physical, material existence. Okay, so there goes the existence of an afterlife. And in some sense, most features of supernatural religions as we have come to know them, right? Including the God. Most of the time, right, with most religions, God is viewed as being all-powerful and supernatural in various ways, right? Well, again, they're denying anything supernatural. So there goes most gods associated with most religions. Free will, hopefully it's kind of clear now why the materialist position is usually thought to be inconsistent with free will. Where can we find free will if we, like everything else, are just a material physical process? A product of neurons firing in certain ways and maybe an interaction with other physical phenomena in our environment, right? But if we're just a product, in some sense a response to various stimuli, where is the room for free will? Souls and minds, that's the most obvious in our context thing that's rejected, okay? Right? They're discounting the very notion of a mind. There is no distinction, right? All is body. Okay, we might call this what we associate with brain, or sorry, thoughts, emotions, etc. We could associate that with the brain, but the brain is really just a part of the body, right? It's still physical, it's still bodily. Okay? So there goes souls or minds. Any of that religious talk regarding souls is usually associated with our mental, right? Our minds, right? That's what's thought to move on if there is an afterlife, right? If the soul moves on, it's usually associated with that immaterial component, or what the dualist associates with the immaterial component of our existence. Yeah. Well, the materialist is rejecting all that, or at least in theory, it seems like they are. Okay. Everybody good on materialism? Well, so we were talking about this earlier, right? It seems like some of this newest scientific stuff, you're almost like, they say, right, they're able to predict what's going to go on in the minds of the person. Like, I think Nagel and some of the critics of materialism are still going to insist that there's some aspect of what it's like to be Jason. Like, granted, these machines can kind of suggest, well, Jason's going to feel anger here in a minute. He's maybe even going to raise his right arm, right? But there's something it's like for Jason to experience that we still can't access. That's what Nagel's going to insist. There's something it's like to be a bat. Even if we can measure and predict everything the bat's going to do, there's something about what it's like to be a bat that is mysterious to us. Granted that, do I still have access of what it's like for you? Do I know what that experience is like for you? Like, because we can be subjected to the same ostensive objective environment, and what you're getting out of it, it could be radically different than what I'm getting out of it. And we're still both measuring that we're angry or something on a machine, right? But what that looks like from your own subjective, again, me trying to respond from like, so Nagel's going to be the one that is going to famously suggest there's a problem with materialism. It can't adequately capture the subjective character of conscious experience. There's something that we know there's something it's like to be a bat, but that we can't ever access that. He makes it in the terms from that angle, right? In terms of a bat. And so I think he would just insist, granted, we get better and better at kind of predicting the behavior of bats and so on. There's still this sense in which we can never actually access the experience from the bat's perspective, is what he's going to say. Now, again, the materialist is going to say, kind of like I think where you're kind of inclined to lean, that doesn't, I mean, no, we can capture that. But I think the dualist is just going to respond, right? Someone like Nagel, they're still going to have a response to that, whether it's convincing or not. Of course, the materialist is going to say, no, it's not convincing. But yeah, that's something that's brought up, though. Like, it does seem like we're getting better and better. Our machinery, our sciences are getting better and better at predicting what humans are going to do. So that seems to suggest there's no freedom therein if we're able to actually just predict always what you're going to do. And again, maybe it seems to suggest that we're just a physical process. You know, we can almost predict exactly what you're going to do with all these various stimuli. Raise them in Boston and subject them to certain experiences and have them in Dr. Musil's Philosophy 100 class and yada, 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 and then here's what's going to happen. Yeah, in theory, if we could know all that stuff, and we'll get into it, actually it gets really interesting, right? The determinist is going to suggest, if in theory we could know everything in this moment, we could predict exactly what's going to happen moving forward, because it is all stimulus response. And I'm like, hang on though. We'll at least be patient enough to, not that you wouldn't, but be patient and see what Nagel, right? That Nagel reading in particular, I think I'd be curious to hear what you're going to make of it. But okay, so the flip side of this major debate. Again, these are the two key positions that we're going to focus on. We'll acknowledge idealism here in a moment, but we're really going to focus on these two. Okay, the flip side. Right, so we saw the blue corner, so to speak, right? The red corner then is dualism, the opposite view. No, there is something truly special or unique that is signaled by this conscious experience. It really does seem to truly indicate a unique, different, distinct type of existence. There really is a viable distinction between the mind and body. As the Arjo text puts it, dualism, quote, holds to the view that the mind is an exception, that in some way we are more than purely physical beings. So there's essentially, hence dualism, right, as opposed to these two monistic views. All that exists is material. All that exists are ideas, perceptions. Here, the idea is there's two, dual, right? Two types of existence. Hence, there really is a valid distinction between the mind and body. Right? We can't conflate both of them to one or the other, as these two camps suggest. Okay. Quote, the theory that there is a mind or soul separate from the body is called dualism. So that's from 314 of our text. Now, in fairness to the materialists, because we already highlighted the chief difficulty for them, which is arguably the impetus for this entire debate in the first place, right? The dualist, rather, is going to suggest they don't really adequately handle the phenomenon consciousness, right? The very impetus for us engaging in this debate in the first place, right? It does seem like, or at least for a lot of us, that there is truly something different about our internal experience. It's not as accessible. Fortunately, you guys aren't privy to all these thoughts, right? Like you are, like we can all access, all 28 of us can see. And even if we're blind, right, we could come up and feel and maybe even hear this stuff, right? Fortunately, you guys don't all have access to this subjective experience of my own ideas, right? There seems to be something different there. So that's the big hurdle, or at least the dualist is going to suggest that's the big problem the materialist doesn't adequately flesh out. Well, the dualist notoriously has his or her own major issue as well, and I think I alluded to this earlier, right? How do these actually, if you're going to insist they truly are distinct, how do you explain the interaction between them, right? Because the dualists are usually positing that there is this interaction between them, right? So didn't they give the example of like stepping on a nail And then like, so you get like a physical pain, that's a physical thing, right? And then the next thing you know, or sorry, that's a physical thing that happens. The next thing you know, you experience pain mentally. So says the dualist, right? So we have something happening in the material world that then creates an effect in the mental world. And then it works the other way too for the dualist, right? I can have an idea, so something starts as an idea in my mind, I'm going to raise my right hand. And then it actually affects change in the material world. Well, if these are two truly distinct types of existence, and presumably there's no point of, where's the point of connection then? How is the one material medium actually bringing about a change in the immaterial medium? Where's the point of connection? Like, how do they actually affect one another? Right? If it's truly material, the body is truly material, and this other realm of ideas is immaterial, how can the one, if it's truly distinct, bring about consequences in the other? How do you explain that, you dualists? Well, Descartes famously does try to suggest an answer. Do you guys know? Well, he does say that famously, but no, where does he suggest the mind meets the body, so to speak? Nobody? Famously, the pineal gland, which is really interesting, because picking up on something you said before in terms of these guys didn't have a lot of what we now know to work with. And what's really interesting, I think his name was Richard or Rick Strassman. I might screw this name up. So I believe this is the dude's name. He was like, I want to say he taught at Harvard or maybe still teaches at Harvard. I actually first sort of encountered this guy on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I was fascinated by the stuff they were talking about. And so this is a guy that studies near-death experiences, or NDEs, and so he did a lot of research and noticed like lots of patterns. And so one of the things they found was the pineal gland during these near-death experiences releases DMT, right, a certain molecule, okay, which is also released by the pineal gland when we dream. Okay, so some really funky stuff going on. And so Strassman hypothesized, the book, fascinating book by the way, highly recommend it, called The Spirit Molecule, referencing DMT. He literally calls this molecule the spirit molecule. And it's secreted by the pineal gland. And his theory is, he's calling it the spirit molecule because he posits, given again the patterns we see in these near-death experiences, the body, when it senses it's near death, secretes this as a kind of transitory, I don't know, as a part of the transition between death, right, and then whatever comes next, right, the spiritual existence thereafter, right? So he calls it the spirit molecule because, again, it does seem to be involved in like that end of physical life sort of possible transition to whatever comes next. DMT is in everything, yeah, and yeah, it's pretty interesting, like, because the Rogan also talks about like doing DMT, right, and it's some really interesting sort of experiences. And so they actually, Strassman does clinical trials where they subject people to DMT, and they had there's a lot of common patterns there too. So really fascinating. I would highly encourage you guys to check out that book, The Spirit Molecule. I mentioned all that just to kind of reflect back on. It's kind of interesting because again, Descartes wasn't privy to all this, right? And yet, fascinatingly, he does locate this possible point of connection in the pineal gland, which, given, again, some of the stuff we learned, maybe that was on the right track, right? I mean, it kind of makes sense if you're going to pick some sort of physiological point of interaction, that it would be this mysterious pineal gland, which really is, to some extent, still pretty mysterious for us. But anyway, so that general question of like, you're going to tell me these are two truly distinct types of existence, and how do you explain their interaction? Okay, that is I would say, the most significant notorious problem for the dualist. Okay, idealism. Again, we are kind of running out of time, and furthermore, we've already kind of alluded to idealism, so I'm going to keep it nice and short and sweet here. We know what the idea or position is, okay? And real brief, right, we've already talked about the justification for it, at least from Berkeley's perspective. It's born out of, and this is the point here, a lot of, at least the metaphysical idealists I'm familiar with, like Berkeley, a lot of them, right, and them taking that metaphysical stance is a result of epistemological skepticism, right? How can we be sure, right? It seems to be a matter of faith that there is anything outside of our own perceptions. Again, it's not something we experience, because our experience, at least up to this point, has been confined to our own perceptions. So it's not, this notion of an external world isn't rooted in anything we've experienced. It's not something we can reason ourselves to. It's not rationally justified. Okay, so Berkeley says, on what basis are we positing the existence of anything that would continue to exist independent of our perceptions? Or call it the external material world, call it whatever you want. Right? It doesn't seem to be well-founded. So that's the view of the idealist, right? It suggests that all that exists is mental or spiritual or ideas. Okay, so it's a monistic view, kind of the opposite of materialism. All that exists is mental. Okay. I don't mean to suggest, did I make this point already, that it's any less meritorious. I happen to think it can be just as well argued as the other two views, right? But again, just practical considerations, we have to toss some stuff out, right? Because we don't have enough time. And I tend to cater to, when that's an issue, right, I can tend to cater to the ones that are more popular. Okay? Because if this class is anything like the first two, not that people can't be wholesale wrong, you know, we've had very popular beliefs that have turned out false, but I assume this class will be no exception. The first two classes, I literally had 0 people identifying with idealism. Okay, so we're going to progress in terms of popularity. Not that this is a popularity contest, but in some sense, right, I got to make some cuts here, and so goodbye idealism. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not answering that. No way. I think I might have given you guys a spiel that I think a good instructor, teacher, hopefully you're still asking that, right? There's nothing that makes me feel better. Well, that's probably not true. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but very few things make me feel better than hearing a student say, well, what do you think at the end of the semester? Because that means that I didn't let my bias shine through, and I think that's really difficult. So, and I don't like to answer those questions here because I don't want my position to affect you at all, right? I want you to come to your own conclusions. I think my thoughts are going to seep through anyway in some sense. You might be able to kind of pick out some things in terms of what I believe, but I try as much as possible to not tell you guys that. So actually what I say though is ask me at the end of the semester and I will, and I'll actually mention like on my channel, like you can, my YouTube channel, there are some videos where I get into my actual own views. And so I'll reiterate that at the end of the semester, but not now. Okay, so idealism, goodbye idealism. Not that you're any worse than the other views, but we just don't have time for you. Speaking of not having time, how is it already 5 minutes left? Okay, so we want to get into briefly, I guess, this related issue then, how do other animals fit into this mix, which has always been a fascinating question for me. It's something I thought a lot about, you know. Again, they seem to have something, you know, experiences that seem congruent with what we mean by having a consciousness or a mind, right? I mean, don't they seem in some sense conscious? Do we want to say they have minds then? That's true, yeah. They can be just like us, conscious and unconscious. So it sounds like most of us want to say yes to this question, that they do have consciousness. I guess it's not the question up here, but like if the answer is yes, these other animals have consciousness, and so presumably then, if we're dualists, minds as well, then is there nothing unique about us? Maybe we're not as significant as a lot of us tend to think. Maybe we're not significantly different, okay? Hey guys, can we please wait to pack things up until we're actually done? I would appreciate that because it's noisy. So again, how do other animals fit into that mix, especially if we're going to suggest, as I think most of us were inclined to do, that they do have what we call consciousness, or what we tend to mean by consciousness. Right? If that's the case, how, if at all, are we going to distinguish them from us? Or are we going to be prepared to say that they also have minds or souls or whatever, and concede that there doesn't seem to be a meaningful difference between us and them? Right? How do we navigate that? Do they also have minds? Are you prepared to say that? Minds, souls, etc. Or can we acknowledge that they also have consciousness and yet still locate some sort of meaningful, significant difference between us and other animals? Right? Well, I would say, again, trying to kind of fly through this, I apologize for the cursory nature of this. I don't know what happened to our time. We were talking about time at the beginning of class too. Yeah, how apropos here. But I would point out a couple things that, you know, at least in my musings I've thought about. Memory, that tends to be something that's associated with consciousness, right, or some element therein. And I would say the cats, animals, exhibit that. right? That first time if you've had a cat, right, you bring the kitty home, you get out the treat bag, it doesn't know any different, like it doesn't act like anything special is going on. The 500th time you go and reach for the cat bag, it's like the cat could be 17 rooms somewhere else, right? And the second you go for the cat bag, it's like, there it is at your feet, right? Memory, right? It's exhibiting some elements of what I would say we associate with consciousness or having a mind, okay? And then what about like feelings? Maybe we want to say they're not quite as intense, or like somebody in a previous section was saying, well, maybe they don't exhibit all the same feelings, or like some animals exhibit empathy, whereas other animals don't offer maybe sophisticated of emotions, but all animals in some sense exhibit some feelings, right? In some way, shape, or form, it seems like many, if not most, if not all animals exhibit what we call like feelings at some rudimentary level, okay? So again, how are we going to explain that? Right? Do we want to say then that they too have a consciousness and in some sense a mind? Right? So how do we go about kind of elucidating a meaningful difference? Maybe there's not a meaningful difference or significant difference between us and other animals. And maybe you guys are okay with that. Maybe that's the truth, right? So, but I think that's an interesting kind of wrinkle in all of this, because a lot of us tend to think that there is something significant or different about us. But if they seem to share all these same things in common, what would be that difference? Now, here's what I've come to in my own musings on this. Maybe when we want to locate the difference in terms of self-consciousness. So maybe all animals, sentient creatures in some sense, are aware or have a consciousness, but maybe we uniquely are aware of that awareness or conscious of that consciousness. We are uniquely pondering, right, the meaning of life and reflecting on this consciousness. Now, maybe it was even you that was on one time like, how do I know? How do you know what's going on in the mind of the dog? But it doesn't seem like the dog is mulling over the meaning of life like yours truly is on a daily basis, right? It seems like maybe that's where we can locate some difference, right? The reflective self-consciousness. I don't know. Or we also made the analogy, maybe I brought this up already, but like maybe the idea is that consciousness isn't an on-off switch, like you're either conscious or you're not. Maybe it's a matter of degrees in a spectrum or a gauge. And so maybe we could say humans are like 100% conscious, and then like elephants and, I don't know, some others are like 90, or maybe some sort of alien species is 100 and humans are like 90, and then dolphins 80 or whatever, right? Real quick before I let you go, okay, summary, blah, blah, blah. I think we went through most of this. I did want to take, so this is just reiterating again some of the implications that follow from, right, the materialist position, okay? The two especially that we're going to build upon later, right? The rejection of free will, and there goes anything religious, it seems like. Real quick, I want to do a couple polls here at the outset. Granted, we haven't had our deep dive yet. Here at the outset, where would you guys identify? You got to pick idealism, dualism, or materialism. Any idealists? Okay, so 0 out of 3 sections. How about, let's start materialism. Interesting. This is, wow. I feel like previous semester is more 50-50. So the rest of you are dualists? Okay. And what about if your choices were, okay, and maybe you're honestly torn, but if you had to pick significantly different from other animals, or no, we're not on a whole significantly different from other animals. If those are your choices, what you going with? Yes, we are significantly different. Okay. No, we're not. Oh, that's our divisive one right there. All right, I got to let you go. Thank you for your patience. I know I kept you like a minute late. Appreciate it.